The Seljuk archers turned to flee, and the Byzantine reserve did not break, it advanced. On August 26, 1071, in the failing light north of Lake Van, the army of Romanos IV Diogenes had spent a long day chasing an enemy that would not stand and fight. As the imperial center wheeled back toward camp at dusk, the moment came that should have unmade an empire. Andronikos Doukas, son of the Caesar John Doukas, held command of the rearguard, and his family despised the emperor he served. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. For the feigned retreat to become a slaughter, the Seljuks needed the rear of the Byzantine line to dissolve. They needed panic. What they received instead was discipline. Andronikos brought the reserve forward to cover the wheeling center rather than peeling it away, and the gap that Alp Arslan's horsemen were riding to exploit simply closed. The trap meant to swallow Romanos' army instead caught the steppe cavalry between the recovering center and a reserve that would not yield. But what the men in that twilight could not yet know, what would take years to fully measure, was how much the next hour would decide. Alp Arslan was taken alive. The Sultan of the Great Seljuks, son of Chagri Beg, who had campaigned for years across Armenia and the Caucasus, found himself a prisoner in a Byzantine tent rather than the master of a broken foe. Romanos, by the accounts that would survive, treated his captive with the same courtesy that history records the Sultan once showing, a recognition between commanders of what the day had nearly cost them both. The emperor marched west, not as a fugitive, but as a victor. He had come to the throne in 1068 by marrying Eudokia Macrymbolitissa, widow of Constantine X, ruling as senior partner to her young sons, and from the first the Doukas family had resented him. The Caesar John Doukas and his nephew, the youthful Michael VII, had waited for the army to fail so they might be rid of the soldier emperor. Now there was no rout to exploit, no captured emperor to disown, no rumor of death to spread through the capital. There was only a man returning to Constantinople with a sultan in his train. The faction that had sharpened its knives found nothing to cut. With the field army intact, Romanos did what a defeated emperor never could. He turned to the frontier itself. The Armenian and Anatolian themes, the military districts that guarded the highland passes, had been thinning for a generation, their soldier farmers neglected and their fortresses left to decay. A man who had lost his army would have had nothing to spend on them. A man who had kept his could rebuild. Garrisons were resettled in the eastern passes above Lake Van. The themata that had marched east were not buried in the field, but returned to their lands, and the recruiting registers that fed the army remained full names rather than lists of the dead. The Norman captain Roussel de Bailleul and his Frankish troops had detached before the engagement, and some of the Oghuz mercenaries had slipped away to their Turkic kin during the campaign. Reminders that an army of the Mata, Varangians, Armenians, and mercenaries was never wholly reliable. But a victorious treasury could afford loyalty, and the highland passes stayed in imperial hands rather than standing open. The capture of Alp Arslan did to the Seljuks what no Byzantine fortress could. It removed the one authority holding the Turkic advance together. The great Seljuk realm was a confederation as much as an empire, its cohesion resting on the prestige and will of the Sultan. And with that figure held hostage in the west, the question of succession opened before its time. Rival claimants and ambitious emirs turned inward. The central authority that had historically organized the settlement of Anatolia, that had directed the steppe horsemen toward the Byzantine plateau as a single pressure, splintered into competing interests across Persia and the Caucasus. The Turkic peoples did not vanish. They remained on the eastern horizon, raiding and probing as they always had. What changed was that no commanding hand now aimed them. The consequences of this fracture would ripple for decades. But to understand why they mattered so greatly, we must first look at what the plateau itself meant to the empire. Anatolia was not a frontier. It was the body of the empire. The plateau and its valleys held the recruiting grounds that filled the themata, the grain that fed the cities, and the revenue that paid the soldiers and the bureaucracy alike. To lose it, as nearly happened, would have been to lose the reservoir from which Byzantine power was drawn. Held instead of forfeited, that reservoir kept refilling. The soldier farmers of the themes raised sons who would serve in their turn. The tax rolls of the Anatolian provinces continued to flow toward Constantinople rather than draining away to settled Turkic lords. An empire that retained its heartland did not need to lean ever more heavily on foreign mercenaries and the dangerous men who led them. It could be, for a time, something close to self-sufficient, a state resting on its own land and its own people rather than on borrowed swords. There were no desperate embassies to the west. In the history that did not happen here, the loss of Anatolia drove a later emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, to appeal to the Latin princes and the papacy for soldiers, an appeal that fed into Pope Urban II's call at Clermont in 195 and the armies of the First Crusade. That road began with catastrophe. Without the catastrophe, the road was never opened. An empire still holding its eastern provinces had no reason to beg for mercenaries from Rome. It did not need to frame its peril in terms that might move a pope to summon the warriors of the Latin world. The most fateful request in the relationship between Eastern and Western Christendom went unsent because the condition that produced it never arose. Whether the great movement of crusading would have found some other spark elsewhere is impossible to say with any certainty. These are currents that historians can only trace, not predict. What can be said is that this particular cause, in this timeline, was absent. The schism of 1254 stood unbridged. Without crusading armies passing through Byzantine lands, without the friction and the fragile cooperation, the broken promises and the shared sieges that historically bound and bruised the two halves of Christendom, the empire's dealings with the Latin West stayed distant and guarded. There was no procession of Frankish and Norman hosts to feed and watch and quarrel with as they crossed Anatolia toward Jerusalem. The estrangement between the churches of Rome and Constantinople, scarcely 2 decades old, was left to harden in its own quiet way, rather than being tested in the heat of joint campaigns. The Latin princes remained a remote and uncertain presence on the empire's western edge, neither close allies nor a flood of armed pilgrims. The two worlds did not collide. They simply continued to drift, separated by doctrine and language and a wariness that no common enterprise arrived to either heal or inflame. The land bridge to Asia remained Byzantine. As the 11th century gave way to the 12th, the empire entered the new age holding the gateway it had so nearly lost: the plateau, the passes, the recruiting grounds, the road east. Its frontier faced not a settled Turkish neighbor planted across the heart of Anatolia, but a divided and quarreling Muslim East, fractured by the succession crisis that the day at Manzikert had set in motion. It would be easy, looking back across this imagined century, to call it a salvation, and easy to forget that no single man saved it. The reserve that held was made of ordinary soldiers obeying an order. The frontier that endured was rebuilt by thousands of unnamed hands. Whether an empire spared this one disaster would have been spared the others that history holds in store: the rival emperors, the foreign debts, the slow erosions that come to every state, is a question this timeline leaves open, as it should remain. What we can see is narrower and surer. On one August evening, a line did not break, and the gateway to Asia stayed in the hands that had held it for 700 years.